Warning, this episode may contain disturbing content, soothing narration, and mild existential dread. Basically, murder ASMR for stressed professionals. Listener discretion is advised. Hell, it might be necessary.
To scorn someone is to reject them, to cast them aside as unworthy. And they say hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. If that's true, Nick Hacheney left quite a trail of potential fury in his wake. Following the death of his wife, Dawn, Nick engaged in relationships with at least 5 different women that we know of. Women he manipulated, women he coerced, women to whom he made promises. Promises he had no intention of keeping, and women he ultimately scorned. Sandy Glass was one of them. She believed Nick loved her. She believed he intended to marry her. She believed God had chosen the two of them for some greater divine purpose. And for years, Nick encouraged her to believe it. But the future he'd promised Sandy never came. And 5 years after Dawn Hacheney's death, Sandy Glass finally did something Nick never anticipated. She told the truth. Sandy didn't intentionally unleash hell, but unleashing the truth was far more dangerous. And that truth had the power to destroy everything Nick Hacheney had built. For years, Nick had talked about spiritual warfare. He portrayed himself as a warrior for God, battling the evil that had infiltrated the church. Anyone who questioned him could be dismissed as an obstacle to God's plan. But in the end, it was Sandy Glass who finally took up the armor of truth. By then, the promises had crumbled, the prophecies had failed, the future Nick had promised her was gone. And without those things holding the illusion together, Sandy could finally see the man behind them. The manipulation, the coercion, the betrayal, the wolf in sheep's clothing. And Sandy was terrified. Terrified of the role she played. Terrified of what she knew. But perhaps most of all, terrified of continuing to live inside the lies that she had spent years believing. So Sandy Glass went to the police, and she told them the truth. The very hard truth. She told them about Nick. She told them about their relationship. She told them about the promises and the prophecies. And she told them Dawn Hacheney had not died accidentally in a fire. Dawn had become an inconvenience to a husband who wanted a different life. So Nick Hacheney killed her. And for nearly 5 years, he got away with it. The fire had been ruled accidental. The irregularities surrounding Dawn's death had been explained away, and the case had been closed, until one woman finally gave investigators a reason to open it again. Sandy Glass was a woman scorned, but reducing what she did to revenge would miss the significance of what came next, because telling the truth placed Sandy herself in danger. She wasn't an innocent bystander. She knew things that could implicate her. She knew things that could destroy her reputation, her relationships, and the life that she'd built. And she told the truth anyway. The truth that would expose Nick Hacheney to the police, to the church, to the women he'd manipulated, and eventually to a jury. For years, Nick had convinced people around him that he was fighting a spiritual war against evil. But Sandy Glass's revolutionary act of truth-telling was about to unleash Nick Hacheney's own personal hell. Her truth would pull away the mask of righteousness he presented to the world and reveal the ugliness and deceit beneath it. The manipulation, the coercion, the predation, all carried out while invoking the name of the Most High. This is the finale of Pulpit and the Pyre, the Murder of Dawn Hacheney on Crime to Burn. Welcome to Crime to Burn, where we explore the dark city landscape where true crime intersects with arson and criminal negligence. Join us as we sift through the ashes to bring you the story of what really happened. Welcome back to Crime to Burn. I'm April, a fire protection engineer, former firefighter, and the sole initiator of the emergency prayer chain, because gossip spreads faster than a Class A fire when it's disguised as spiritual concern.
And I have a big rusty bolt cutter and some shooey for your phooey.
If you're new here, this is the finale of a 3-part series, so you may benefit spiritually from starting at part 1. But if you want to start mid-sermon, don't let us stop you. We will ask for one tiny favor. Please go leave us a 5-star review on your podcast player, and if your app allows written reviews, those are incredibly helpful for getting people to try our show and see if they like us. And honestly, what's not to like? We're science-y, snarky, and bringing you smoldering stories of smoke and soot.
And we smell nice, too.
But what we are not is able to afford a PR team, so we depend on those ratings and reviews to help us find our audience. Now, I had to script this episode earlier than usual because of upcoming family obligations, so at the time of scripting, we were still at 81 reviews on Apple Podcasts and 80 on Spotify. But we did get some early comments over on Podbean. Sophie Brown, thank you for taking such an interest in Winston's butt.
Thanks for thinking about my dog's anus.
Kevin Tarrant, thanks for showing up for us again. Just Becky, always a delight to see you. And welcome to Ivan, who is a new follower and told me a fantastic story related to our Animal Arsonists episode, which was way back at number 19. Seems Ivan was the victim of a similar story involving a squirrel and a power transformer. May God rest the poor squirrel's soul. Thanks for being here with us, Ivan. And if you're on social media, we are too, and you should follow us on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, or X. When you see content from us, hit the like button, leave a comment, reshare it, add it to your favorites. We're feeling the oppression of the algorithm, and your help gets our content in front of fresh eyeballs so we can grow. And we will always be free on your favorite podcast players, supported by ads. But if it's feasible within your budget and you'd like to get all your episodes ad-free, plus get some fun and exclusive sticker drops, head on over to the show notes and look for the link to our Patreon. The next sticker drop is in October, and you have to be a member for 30 days prior to the drop date to qualify, so be sure to get signed up now. Plus, I post the Patreon episodes the second I finish editing them. Sometimes that's a day early. Sometimes it's not. But either way, all of those episodes are ad-free. And our logo looks amazing plastered across your chest. So while you're in the show notes, check out the link to our spread shop so you can find a t-shirt to advertise your superior taste in true crime podcasts. And as always, definitely feel free to email us your episode feedback, personal fire stories, case suggestions, and of course your prayer chain requests at crimetoburn@gmail.com. And remember, I check that email personally. You are getting me directly. I cannot afford someone to read my emails for me, so that's your direct link to having your voice heard if you have something to say. And as we wrap up this case, I want to remind you that the main source for this series is the book A Twisted Faith by Greg Olson. The book delves much deeper into the politics and behind-the-scenes drama at Christ Community Church and the environment in which these crimes unfolded. I highly recommend the book for an even deeper dive, and you can find it all in our sources referenced in the show notes. Now, we opened this series talking about the death of Dawn Hacheney in a horrific house fire, leaving her husband, Pastor Nick Hacheney, a widower. And while there were some significant irregularities in Dawn's autopsy, investigators ultimately accepted an explanation that allowed them to rule her death accidental and close the case. After all, in true crime, we always say, look at the spouse first. But this guy was a pastor. He was well loved and well respected. He wouldn't murder his wife. So when Dawn's autopsy revealed no smoke or soot in her lungs and no toxins in her bloodstream from inhaling smoke, there were understandably some head scratches. But the medical examiner concluded that Dawn must have died from a laryngospasm, and that explained the absence of smoke and soot in her lungs. A laryngospasm can occur when a victim takes a breath of intensely superheated air, causing the vocal cords to slam shut and preventing them from inhaling the products of combustion. And it does happen, but it's not something we would typically expect in an ordinary house fire. It's more consistent with the kind of fire where there isn't any sort of prolonged or slow developing smoldering phase, something like a flash fire or an explosion. And investigators had an explanation for that too. You see, they found small propane cylinders in the bedroom, the little ones like you might use for a camping stove. They had actually been Dawn's Christmas gifts to Nick. Investigators theorized that one of those cylinders may have leaked, creating a flammable fuel-air mixture in the bedroom. Then the space heater produced an electrical arc, igniting that mixture and producing the flash fire that they said would be capable of causing a laryngospasm.
I still think that's a dumb theory.
There were problems with that theory. But those problems would be ignored for an entire 5 years while Nick focused on healing through physical release and the sexual coercion of his congregants and his dead wife's mother. And while using your position as a spiritual leader to coerce vulnerable women out of their drawers is disgusting enough, if Nick Hacheney was actually a murderer who had killed his wife, well, that is an accusation that will get the attention of investigators, even 5 years after the alleged crime. Now recall, it appears Sandy Glass and Nick Hacheney had bought each other custom rings prior to Dawn's death. The implication is that they intended to be together, as Sandy had predicted both her own husband Jimmy's death and Dawn's death as well. And Sandy was viewed by those who knew her through the church as a prophetess, a woman who received visions from God. Now, not all of her prophetic claims came true. But Nick knew that Sandy was vulnerable. He knew she was unhappy in her marriage, that she believed she had a spiritual gift, and she desperately wanted to believe that she had some greater divine purpose here on earth. So Nick fed into every bit of that in order to manipulate her. When Sandy told him that their spouses would both soon be dead, he allegedly ate it up. The two began a physical relationship with plans to marry once they were freed from the bonds of holy matrimony.
I'm curious, had he done something, predicted something, or showed that this was reliable? They're awfully willing to believe it. Trusting somebody, that's one thing, right? But then believing they have some ability to see the future when people are going to be dying and stuff, that's a leap to me. That's a really big leap.
So Sandy had made predictions that did come true to the church. So that's why the church believed she was a prophetess. But she also made predictions that didn't come true.
Well, you shouldn't be able to get more than one of those.
When Sandy's husband flatly refused to keel over, as she had predicted, she started the process of divorcing him. But Nick was a pastor in a charismatic fundamentalist Christian church that absolutely did not approve of divorce. To divorce a wife who was still stubbornly alive would have destroyed his career. Instead, Nick decided to destroy the lives of everyone who loved him, cared for him, and respected him. But before we get to how Nick did that and how he got away with it for 5 years, we need to talk about how things began to unravel for him. We know Nick had relationships with several women, but we're going to focus on 3 of them today. Nicole Matheson, she was the single mother who had suffered a deep betrayal from her husband, and their marriage had fallen apart amid his addiction, and eventually he went on to father a child with another woman. And then there was Annette Anderson. Annette had initially turned to Nick Hacheney for help with her crumbling marriage. But instead of working through those problems with the couple, Nick singled out Annette and began telling her that his own physical desires were God's will. Annette was struggling with depression. She had also spent years in a church environment where she had been taught to defer her judgment on spiritual matters to the church's spiritual leaders. And Nick was one of those leaders. But Annette didn't want to be in a sexual relationship with Nick. Annette wanted to fix her marriage. Somewhere inside, she knew what was happening was wrong, and she repeatedly tried to end the relationship. But Nick had some kind of twisted hold on her. And as it continued, Annette's depression grew worse and worse. Eventually, she became so desperate to get away from Nick that when her husband was offered a job in another town, she jumped at the chance to move away. And then there was Sandy Glass. Sandy knew about Nick's relationships with the other women, but she believed him when he told her that it was all part of God's plan. Nick convinced Sandy that her spiritual purpose was bigger than these earthly physical entanglements, and she just needed to hang on.
To his wiener.
And eventually, the divine plan Nick had promised her would be realized. So Sandy waited and waited. And as Nick's relationships with other women continued, there had to come a point when Sandy began to realize that Nick had no intention of living up to the promises that he had made to her. But she clung to them anyway. She even comforted and encouraged Annette Anderson when Annette, at Nick's recommendation, turned to Sandy to deal with the guilt she felt over having a physical relationship with Nick while she was still married to her husband. And Sandy did exactly what Nick asked. She encouraged Annette to just hang on, that this was all part of God's plan. There's some greater purpose that they just simply couldn't understand yet. But there was one thing Sandy didn't tell Annette. Sandy was sleeping with Nick too. Meanwhile, Nick was now dating Nicole Matheson. And eventually, Nick finally told Sandy the truth. No, they were not going to get married, because Nick was going to marry Nicole. Sandy was understandably devastated.
This is the weirdest way to pull down Poon. I don't approve. You just gotta up your game, man. That's awful.
By then, Annette had moved away, but she and Sandy remained close. And eventually, Annette told Sandy that she'd spoken to another former parishioner who had left the church about her sexual relationship with Nick. Annette had also started going to counseling outside the church. And there, away from Nick and the spiritual framework he'd used to justify what he'd done, Annette was beginning to understand her relationship with Nick very differently. She was beginning to recognize that she had been coerced. And when Sandy heard that, Sandy got scared. She finally admitted to Annette that she too had been having a physical relationship with Nick, and the friendship between the two women imploded. Annette had been lied to. Sandy had been scorned. And both women were now struggling to come to terms with what had actually happened to them. Because for years, Nick Hacheney had maintained control by keeping these women isolated inside their own versions of his story. But now, they were starting to compare notes. And more importantly, outside forces that were not under Nick's control, forces he couldn't manipulate, were getting involved. Therapists, trusted friends, people outside the closed system of the church who could help these women process what had happened to them and determine a path forward. Annette still had not told Craig about her relationship with Nick, so for the time being, she continued to keep that secret. Sandy, too, found a friend to confide in. But what Sandy told her friend wasn't just a story of sexual coercion and broken promises. It was a story of murder. Then one night, Annette Anderson's husband made a comment about Nick, and Annette lost it, saying that Nick was a horrible person. But Craig didn't understand where this was all coming from. So finally, Annette told him she had been sexually involved with their pastor prior to their move. The relationship was over, but Annette now understood that she had been the victim of coercion. Craig was obviously horrified, and he went straight to the person he believed needed to know exactly who Pastor Nick Hacheney was before Nick could hurt another woman. Senior Pastor Bob Smith. Now, by this point, Christ Community Church had splintered. As Pastor Robert Biley pushed the church in increasingly charismatic directions, and tensions between Biley and Hacheney reached a breaking point, Pastor Bob Smith announced that he was leaving Christ Community. But he wasn't retiring. Smith started another church, which initially met in a local gymnasium until they could build a permanent church of their own. And Hacheney went with them. And there, Nick remained the youth pastor. As soon as Smith's departure was announced, he said his phone began ringing off the hook. Frightened congregants wanting to know what would happen to those extraordinarily personal files created during their deliverance counseling sessions. Smith assured them that before announcing his departure, he had destroyed those records in order to protect the people whose deepest secrets were contained inside them. But when Craig Anderson came to Bob Smith with the truth about Nick, Smith did not want to believe him. Nick was a man he had viewed almost as a son, a man who had lived in his home after the fire, a man who had spent holidays with his family. But Smith was now facing an allegation he could not simply ignore. So he took the church roster and started making phone calls. He contacted women in the congregation and began asking whether they'd ever had problems with Nick Hacheney, whether Nick had ever crossed a line, whether he'd ever behaved inappropriately toward them. And as is probably obvious by now, the 5 women we've discussed were not his only victims. Smith immediately went to the board of his new church and told them that Nick could not remain a pastor. And because some of the women in the congregation had been his victims, Nick would no longer be welcome in the church at all. Because while Christianity teaches forgiveness and allows people the opportunity to repent, forgiveness does not require you subject victims to their abusers.
No, it does not.
So Nick Hacheney was out. Meanwhile, Sandy Glass's friend and confidant was trying to convince her that she had to go to police with what she knew about Nick's involvement in Dawn's death. But Sandy was terrified. She worried she could be considered an accomplice. She worried she could be charged with a crime for failing to come forward sooner. She worried investigators might believe that she had helped conceal Dawn's murder. And Sandy had children that she needed to raise. Going to police might expose Nick, but it also might destroy her own life. So before Sandy Glass could tell investigators the truth, she and her friend went to a lawyer. And with legal counsel, Sandy then went to police and arranged for an immunity deal in exchange for her testimony against Nick in the murder of Dawn Hacheney. But there was a problem. Dawn's death had been ruled an accident. So before investigators could charge Nick with anything, they first had to determine whether there was evidence that a murder had even occurred. So they went back to the original theory of the fire, a leaking propane cylinder that had supposedly created a flammable fuel-air mixture that was then ignited by an electrical spark from a space heater.
Dumbest theory ever.
Well, the scene itself was obviously no longer available to evaluate, but the crime scene photographs were. And investigators could now look at those photographs again, this time with the possibility that the fire had been intentionally set.
I got a question. Do you think that fire investigator really believed that, or do you think he was just trying to clear some off his desk?
Well, I don't know anything about the actual fire investigator, so...
Like, that's a bit contrived.
Yeah.
Oh, the propane cylinder spontaneously started leaking. Like, it wasn't leaking in the store, and it wasn't leaking on the way home. But now, it just started leaking out of nowhere. This doesn't happen.
We're about to talk about that.
I don't believe this investigator either was very smart or cared at all about what he was doing.
I can understand why you might come to that conclusion, because it does not seem that this fire was ever really investigated until after Sandy came forward.
Isn't that a little bit terrifying? So we found that one thing, right? But how many other things came before it that just got slid back off his desk and, oh, we'll just make up some, right?
And investigators could now look at those photographs again, this time with the possibility that the fire had been intentionally set. And they noticed some additional irregularities. For one thing, Dawn had been in bed with paper, wrapping paper. Now, Nick had told investigators that he and Dawn had unwrapped their Christmas gifts the night before. But some of that wrapping paper was actually in the bed with Dawn, around her body. It does seem a little odd that a woman would go to bed and sleep in the discarded wrapping paper. And then there was Dawn's toxicology. Dawn had Benadryl in her system. A lot of Benadryl. Now, Nick had told investigators that Dawn had been fighting a cold and took Benadryl before bed to help her sleep. And according to Nick, she woke up again around 2 a.m. and took more because she was still having trouble sleeping. But Dawn's toxicology results indicated a concentration approximately 10 times the normal therapeutic level. It seems unlikely that a woman simply trying to get some sleep would intentionally take 10 times the therapeutic amount.
At this point, I have another question, though. Have you ever tasted a Benadryl? That tastes awful. It's one of the worst tasting things if you don't just swallow it, right? How do you get 10 of those into somebody without them knowing it?
That I don't know. So how had that not immediately raised alarms? Well, there was a legitimate forensic complication. Pathologists pointed to something called postmortem redistribution. Because of the extensive damage to Dawn's body, the only blood available for toxicology had been collected from her heart. Postmortem redistribution is essentially what happens when drugs already distributed throughout the body begin moving between tissues and blood after death. Once circulation stops and the tissues around it die, they release the stuff that was inside them, and it ends up in the fluids nearby because the body is no longer maintaining equilibrium that it did during life. That means the concentration measured during an autopsy may not accurately represent the concentration that was circulating in that person's blood while they were alive.
So does that mean it would be more concentrated or less concentrated?
More.
Wow.
Specifically for Benadryl.
So it was already 10 times more.
Right.
But theoretically, it was way more than that.
No, they're saying that the toxicology said it was 10 times more, and people are like, why didn't the police ever look at this in the first place? And the police were like, because we were told about this postmortem redistribution. What happens is Benadryl collects in the liver and in a bunch of tissues that sit around the heart. And so after she dies, those cells die, they give up the stuff inside them and it falls back into the blood, and it tends to collect right around the heart. And so you'll get a much higher concentration. So that's why when they do toxicology testing, they want to take the blood from an extremity. But Dawn didn't have any extremities left to take blood from. Now, central blood, particularly blood collected from the heart, can show substantially different drug concentrations after death than blood collected from peripheral vessels in the extremities. That's one reason forensic pathologists generally prefer to take blood from an arm or leg for toxicology, when it's available. But in Dawn's case, it wasn't. Her extremities had been destroyed by the fire. Investigators and the pathologist had to work with what remained. And diphenhydramine, the actual drug in Benadryl, is known to undergo significant post-mortem redistribution. So the extraordinarily high concentration in Dawn's heart blood couldn't simply be interpreted to mean that Dawn had 10 times the normal amount circulating through her body before she died. At least, not based on the toxicology results alone. But 10 times the therapeutic amount? That is a lot, even for post-mortem redistribution to explain. And when investigators asked Sandy about the Benadryl, she revealed that Nick had eventually confessed to her that he had intentionally given Dawn too much Benadryl, and then he suffocated her with a plastic bag. According to Sandy, Nick even admitted that Dawn had been awake and aware of what he was doing, and he knew because he could see her through the plastic. And somehow, even while confessing to Sandy that he had drugged his wife and suffocated her while she was conscious, Nick still invoked God to justify what he'd done. He referenced the book of Joshua. In Joshua 1:11, as the Israelites prepared to cross the Jordan into the land God had promised them, Joshua instructs the people to prepare themselves, because within 3 days they will cross over and possess the land God is giving them. And Nick took that passage and twisted it into justification for murder. He told Sandy that God had instructed him to, quote, take the land, unquote.
That book was not written about you. It was not written to you. You can't just recycle these old stories and use them for whatever purpose you think is appropriate.
And okay, but this all still was just the word of a woman who had been incredibly hurt by Nick. Investigators couldn't prove that Nick had smothered Dawn simply because Sandy said he'd confessed to it. So they had to go back to the fire itself. Specifically, they needed to reconsider the original theory that a leaking propane cylinder had created a flammable fuel-air mixture in the bedroom, resulting in a flash fire.
Did they find a propane cylinder with a frickin' hole in it?
I'm getting to that.
Okay.
That's the next part. And to understand what they found, we need to talk about how these little propane cylinders actually work. First, these cylinders have a Schrader-type valve surrounded by threads. The valve itself contains a spring-loaded pin. When the cylinder is screwed onto a compatible appliance, something like a camping stove, a probe inside the connector depresses that pin, opening the valve to allow the propane to flow. But when you disconnect the appliance, the probe is removed and the spring pushes the valve closed again, stopping the flow of propane. The threaded connection also requires multiple turns to fully engage that valve. As the appliance is screwed onto the cylinder, the connection seals before the probe fully depresses the valve. So by the time propane's allowed to flow, you should already have a sealed connection. In other words, these things aren't designed so you can just barely bump the connection loose and have propane merrily dumping into the room. Now, these cylinders also have pressure relief valves, or PRVs. Now, they usually look like a small recessed fitting near the main valve assembly. Propane expands as its temperature increases. So, if a cylinder were to get too hot, say if it's sitting in the trunk of a car on a really hot summer day, and the pressure inside the cylinder rises, that pressure relief valve is there to prevent that pressure from continuing to increase until the cylinder itself ruptures. If that internal pressure exceeds the valve set point, it overcomes the spring holding the relief valve closed and the propane is vented from the cylinder. And yes, that means propane is intentionally being released. But the alternative in this particular situation is allowing a pressurized container full of flammable gas to catastrophically fail, so we'll take the valve. When one of those valves opens, the escaping propane can produce a very noticeable hissing sound. And once enough pressure's been relieved, that internal pressure falls back below the valve's closing pressure, and the spring reseats, and the valve stops the flow. It is a pressure relief device. It is not supposed to open and just casually empty an entire cylinder. So, if one of these canisters had failed or leaked before the fire, investigators would have expected some kind of failure that created an opening that was not protected by one of these spring-loaded valves. And if that had happened, the propane would have continued escaping until the cylinder was completely empty. But not a single one of the cylinders recovered from Dawn's bedroom was completely empty. Instead, what investigators found was consistent with the cylinders being in the room when the fire occurred. The fire heated the cylinders, the propane inside expanded, the pressure increased. When that pressure got high enough, the pressure relief valves opened and released some of the propane until the pressure dropped and the valve reclosed. Then if the cylinder heated up more, the pressure would build up again, the valve would reopen, and once the pressure equalized, the valve would close again. And that cycle can continue as long as the cylinder is continuously exposed to heat. But eventually the fire was extinguished, the cylinders cooled, the pressure stopped increasing, and there was still propane left inside all of them.
How could a fire investigator, a professional, not know that?
I don't know.
That's why I think it sounds so dumb.
And that was a serious problem for the original theory of the fire. If investigators were right that one of these cylinders had suffered some kind of failure and leaked enough propane into the bedroom to create a fuel-air mixture responsible for a flash fire, which cylinder leaked? None of them were empty. But investigators didn't stop there. They also reached out to the cylinder manufacturer. Maybe there had been a problem with these cylinders, a known defect, a bad batch, a recall, some history of the valves failing and allowing propane to escape. Nope. According to the manufacturer, in all of the years that they had been producing these cylinders, they had received exactly 0 reports of a failure that resulted in the release of propane.
Now, I don't want to sound funny, but a propane tank is actually a really good piece of engineering, and I really trust them.
Not one. And let's talk about what we would expect if there had been a propane flash fire.
I trust a propane cylinder way more than I trust a preacher.
If enough propane had accumulated in that bedroom to create a flammable fuel-air mixture, and that mixture suddenly ignited, we would expect a rapid pressure increase. In an enclosed room, that pressure can be enough to blow out the windows. But that's not what witnesses described. The witness who called 911 reported that the fire was already burning and producing heavy smoke when the bedroom window was sucked in and broke. So the window failure did not mark the sudden ignition of a room full of propane. It happened after the fire was already well underway. So the propane leak? No. If there had been a leak that wasn't caused by the heat of the fire triggering one of those pressure relief valves, investigators would have expected at least one of those canisters to be completely empty, and given the safety features of the spring-loaded Schrader valve, it is incredibly difficult for propane to leak out through that valve. And then there was Dawn. She had those extremely high levels of Benadryl, a sedating medication in her system. There was wrapping paper in her bed with her, which is a weird way to sleep. And if there wasn't a propane-fueled flash fire, then the explanation for Dawn's laryngospasm falls apart too. Because without a sudden blast of superheated air closing her airway, an unconscious but living Dawn should have continued breathing as the fire developed, and she would have inhaled smoke. And there should have been soot in her airway. There should have been evidence of carbon monoxide exposure in her blood, but there wasn't. The propane theory had explained away nearly every strange finding in Dawn's original autopsy, and now that theory was falling apart. And without it, the physical evidence was pointing toward a very different conclusion. Dawn Hacheney was already dead when that fire started, and they had a witness now willing to testify that Nick had confessed to her. According to Sandy, Nick told her he had drugged Dawn with Benadryl, smothered her with a plastic bag, placed the wrapping paper around her body, and ignited it, and then left for his hunting trip. Suddenly, Sandy's story wasn't standing on its own. The physical evidence looked to be telling the same story. And on September 12, 2001, Bremerton police arrested Nick Hacheney and charged him with first-degree murder for Dawn's death. And exactly 5 years to the day after Dawn died, on December 26, 2002, Nick Hacheney was convicted of aggravated first-degree murder, and Sandy Glass was the prosecution's chief witness. Nick did not take the stand in his own defense. Now, Nick Hacheney has always maintained his innocence, and after his conviction, he did appeal and actually won, sort of. You see, aggravated first-degree murder requires an aggravating factor, something beyond the murder itself that makes the crime eligible for the enhanced charge and punishment. And in Nick's case, prosecutors argued that Dawn's murder occurred in the course of another felony, arson. That aggravating factor mattered because Nick's original conviction carried a mandatory sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. But Nick's attorneys identified a problem with the prosecution's own theory of the crime. According to prosecutors, Nick drugged Dawn with Benadryl and suffocated her with a plastic bag. And then, after Dawn was already dead, he placed the wrapping paper around her body and set the fire. So his attorneys argued that if you accept the prosecution's version of events, the murder did not occur during the commission of the arson. Dawn was already dead. The murder was complete. Then Nick committed arson.
That's the weirdest technicality. Oh, yeah, he totally killed her. And then totally put wrapping paper around her and lit her aflame. But, hey, go easy on him, because why?
And the Washington Supreme Court agreed. So in 2007, the court overturned the aggravated portion of Nick's conviction, which meant the mandatory life without parole sentence could no longer stand. So let's just appreciate the irony here for a minute. Nick Hacheney maintains that he did not murder his wife, but he successfully used the prosecution's assertion that Dawn was already dead when he set the fire to get his life without parole sentence thrown out. In June of 2008, Nick was resentenced for first-degree murder to 26 years and 8 months in prison with credit for the time he had already served. And as of the scripting of this episode, Nick Hacheney is officially scheduled for release from prison on May 12, 2027, next year, after spending more than 25 years behind bars. And apparently Nick has found ways to occupy himself in prison. He has become a writer. And the worm guy. It seems Nick decided the prison's food waste problem could be addressed with a worm farm. And currently, thanks to Nick, some 6 million worms are also incarcerated in Washington state. I doubt they realize it. They're just happily eating the food scraps and making fertilizer. In fact, Nick even gave a TEDx talk from prison about his worms. Shockingly, Nicole Matheson did go on to marry Nick after his incarceration. However, the two have since divorced. And as we look back at this case, it's easy to ask how these women, and I assure you they were not the only women who eventually told Pastor Bob Smith that Nick had, at a minimum, behaved inappropriately with them, how they could have been sucked into believing that Nick spoke for God. How could they believe the relationships he coerced them into were somehow holy? And in hindsight, some of it borders on insanity, but coercion is a subtle and slow process, and that process often starts with trust. False teachers and false prophets don't necessarily walk through the door spewing obvious lies. They bring enough truth with them to break down your initial guard. And coercive control works by slowly moving the boundaries. One compromise, one rationalization, one step at a time. Until eventually you've traveled so far from where you started that you can't clearly see how you got there or how to find your way back. And that is why discernment matters. But what is discernment? By the dictionary definition, it's basically good judgment, moral clarity, and perception. But discernment is so much bigger than that. Discernment is a process. Discernment means being willing to test what you believe and what you're being taught. Specifically in regards to faith, discernment means testing it against scripture, testing it against your conscience, testing it against the wisdom of other people you trust, looking at the fruits it produces, and giving it time. Discernment is not certainty. It's not a feeling. It's not the hair on the back of your neck standing up. It is a willingness to continually test what we believe. And true discernment rarely happens in isolation. Nick Hacheney discouraged those tests. He isolated people from outside voices. He reinterpreted scripture to serve his own desires. He appealed to emotion while teaching people to distrust their own judgment and look at the fruit it produced. manipulation, secrecy, broken marriages, broken families, abuse, and even murder. And that is why discernment matters. Not because it guarantees that we will never be deceived, but because truth does not need to be protected from examination. And that principle extends far beyond religion. Whatever organization you belong to, whatever ideology you embrace, whatever person you trust enough to follow, the standards you test them against may be different, but the process matters. Test, question, challenge, re-examine, and be willing to change your mind when what you learn no longer supports what you believed. And here's perhaps the hardest truth that I have to share, particularly when we're talking about coercion inside faith-based organizations. The Bible teaches us that human beings are created in the image of God, but that doesn't mean every person is good. It means that even people capable of profound evil can possess qualities that we ordinarily associate with goodness. Think of them as reflections of the image of God in which they were created. They can be intelligent and compassionate, generous, charismatic. They can make you laugh. They can know scripture better than you. They can say things that are true and do things that are kind. And none of those things by themselves mean they do not also have evil inside them or that they are a fully trustworthy person. Nick Hacheney wasn't easily identifiable as a monster because he didn't look like some cartoon villain. He was intelligent and compassionate and knowledgeable about scripture, and people found him likable, and he was very charismatic. And he used those very qualities, the qualities people could easily interpret as evidence that the Holy Spirit was working through him, to gain trust and manipulate the people around him. And that is what I want everyone to walk away with. Sometimes the worst monsters wear the most convincing masks. So don't be afraid to examine what you've been taught. Don't be afraid to question someone you trust. Don't be afraid to listen when something inside you says what you're being told doesn't align with what you know to be right. Don't outsource your judgment, not even to us. Practice discernment again and again and again, because the truth can always withstand scrutiny. And if anything we've discussed in this series feels too familiar, if you're questioning whether a religious group, an organization, or an individual in your life is using coercion or undue influence to control you, we have included a link in the show notes to the Freedom of Mind Resource Center. The website is freedomofmind.com, but the link is also in the show notes. And you don't have to decide whether what you're experiencing deserves the label of cult or control or coercion before you're allowed to ask for help. And that's Pulpit and the Pyre, the Murder of Dawn Hacheney, on Crime to Burn. So this is weekday Crime to Burn.
No one else knows that.
The work to-do list is just needs to be taken out back and shot.
We can arrange that.
We don't want to be those neighbors.
We're not those neighbors.
What I am worried about is the neighbor bear.
I ain't worried about him either.
I just don't want to have to climb the ridge like a mountain goat anymore, picking up trash.
Right.
If I'm going to climb the ridge like a mountain goat, I want it to be on my terms. Not chasing empty cans of dog food and
Yum yum sauce.
Yum sauce.
The bear likes Asian food.
He likes the gyoza sauce, that's for sure. And I don't know what it was, but the dog was growling at the edge of the patio last night, just standing there growling into the darkness. But usually when Winston senses like an animal of some kind, he's all barky, barky, barky. And it felt really unusual for him to be low, growl, head down, hackles up.
He acts different with you than he does with me too, though. He doesn't growl at shit or bark at shit when I'm out there. I mean, he'll bark at invisible things that aren't really there. But that's it. Like, if there's actually an animal, he just watches it and looks at me to see what to do.
Well, I don't know that there was actually an animal or not, but something had him all hackles up. And I was like, you know what? I don't need that tarp. Just going to pull this lawnmower right in front of this door like a big tripping hazard.
It's my new favorite koozie.
I know.
Oh, you knew that? I already mentioned that?
Last week when you got it.
Well, I like it so nice I said it twice. Probably not going to be my last opportunity to shit on cult members, but that's a lot of pocket for what? I just don't understand.
To scorn someone is to reject them, to cast them aside as unworthy.
It was probably just me, but I heard to score on someone.
Oh,
It's probably just me.
That's a different podcast.
But let's pronounce scorn really well since it's right out of the gate.
I didn't include it in the episode, but he would compare himself to David.
The Bible David? The King David. Because why?
Oh, because he said he was the chosen one.
Chosen for what? To be a douchebag? Got locked in the beer closet.
Sound travel's weird in the mountains.
Especially when you're in your house.
Man, I still need to shift it.
I think you need to mount that differently.
Okay. And if you were on social...
If you're on social blah, blah, get off immediately. What is it doing?
Loving you. Cats seem to almost universally be very attracted to the smell of bleach. So I think since you cleaned the porch, there's probably some bleach on your boots, and she is just loving it.
She really is into what she's doing all over my leg. I didn't know that was a thing.
Yeah, Zulu used to do the same thing. I would have to lock the bathrooms after I cleaned them because she would just get in the bathtub and roll around.
Cleanliness is next to catliness.
It sure is. Collected from peripheral vessels in the extremities.
It's peripheral. You said peripheral.
Now, central blood, particularly blood collected from the heart, can show substantially different drug concentrations after death than blood collected peripheral.
You don't like that word, do you? You usually say peripherally, don't you?
Then blood collected from peripheral. Peripheral? Did I say that right? I don't know how the word is supposed to be pronounced. It's tartlets.
Yeah, peripheral.
Peripheral?
It's on the periphery. I'm having a cramp in my rib meat. Why's it gotta be the rib meat? Oh, there's no way to flex that. Build a bunch of muscles, they said. They will never revolt against you.
I don't know how to help you.
I don't either. Oh, yes, give me the pain. Give it to me.
Maybe drink some more water. Dehydration can make muscle cramping worse.
I'm the most hydrated person you know.
If there had been a leak that wasn't caused by the heat of the fire triggling?
Yeah, I like to triggle once in a while.
You want to triggle me later?
Yeah, of course. If I was a bear, I'm pretty close to a bear. I'm just small. That wouldn't work with me at all.
So for those of you listening, we have had the bear break into our trash can 3 times this week. And he doesn't just leave the trash around the trash can. He drags it up the slope. So I have to climb the slope like a mountain goat with trash bags, repacking all the trash in trash bags, while my husband stands over me with a rifle, just in case the juvenile male bear that doesn't seem to have a good, respectful fear of the scent of humans comes back. This particular bear has been more, what's the right word, outgoing than the bears we've had in previous seasons.
He's a social bear.
He's a social bear. He needs to be encouraged to be more of an introvert. Trying to hurt people.
Well, I like the bear. I would like to just sit down with him over a bologna sandwich and be like, look, bear, this is my trash. It's not delicious. I have bologna sandwiches. You could knock on the door. I'll give you a sandwich.
I don't think we have any bologna. Maybe a cheese sandwich.
Why are you ruining? No one knows that.
Sorry.
God, you're here to usurp me, aren't you?
No.
Usurper. I just hadn't found the right groups. The ones that aren't afraid of me.
Right. I'm not afraid of you. I'm the leader of your group. I'm the head groupie. The groupie on your head.
Wow.
So next week, we're going to be releasing the interview with Jeff Plunkett. And then after that, we're going to start a brand new series. Yeah. This one in New Orleans.
No.
So get your beads, get your hurricanes, the drink, not the storm.
I was going to suggest a hand grenade, but yeah.
Okay, your hand grenades. That's fine.
I love Creole food.
I do too. I gave myself anaphylactic reactions twice accidentally when I was living in New Orleans because the food was so good, and I would forget to ask if their seafood stock for gumbo had lobster or crab in it.
The answer is yes.
Yeah. I know. I proved it. Captain of our boat tour for the alligator tour, he was missing 2 fingers from alligators. And so he explains how he lost his fingers from alligators to warn us to keep our hands inside the boat. And then he leans over the boat and picks up an alligator. And he was like, this is how I lost them.
Hey, what do you do when you fall off the horse?
Get right back on.
You're supposed to say, I don't know, I'm not a gymnast.
I don't know, I'm not a gymnast. Maury. Was it?
Yeah, yeah, you got it.
And now a PSA from Crime to Burn. You can trust your propane cylinders. They have spring-loaded valves, pressure relief devices, redundant safeguards, and decades of engineering specifically designed to keep them from ruining your day. People, on the other hand, have opinions, unresolved childhood trauma, and access to Facebook. Trust your propane cylinders, not your people. This has been a public service announcement from Crime to Burn.
You know, Jesus flipped tables, and he was a pacifist.
I don't know what to do for a sign-off. These are always hard. Everything's so hard.
You're making me hard.
That's not a good sign-off.
The Rotary Club is nothing if not prepared
to run downhill.
You're going to say, Hema.
No, that's probably not it at all. The local bears have discovered soy sauce, and there's not going to be any going back.
Once you get a taste for the yum-yum.
Honestly, same.
You take my trash and sneak over here and eat my yum-yum sauce. Just look me in the eye and eat my yum-yum sauce like a bear. Be cowering behind the bushes like a little bitch-ass bear. Look me in the eye and say, this is my yum-yum sauce now.
All right. We're going to go secure our trash cans. Y'all have a nice day. Crime to Burn is a production of Crime to Burn, LLC, where we light fires in your brain and not your buildings. All rights reserved. Still spiritually parched after this episode? It's okay, Steve believes in cross-pollination. Here's a trailer for a show we think deserves to infiltrate your ear holes in a good way. Don't forget to leave a 5-star review before you go. Steve is watching.
Hi, everyone. We are the hosts of Like Mother, Like Murder, a true crime momcast.
You heard that right. We are a momcast, which is our unique twist in the true crime world.
What sets us aside is that our content is mainly mom-related, from missing moms to murdered moms,
to moms who committed the crime, survivors, and more.
We are getting started on our 3rd season with over 100 episodes that you guys can go and binge. I am Rachel.
And I'm Heather. We drop new episodes every Tuesday, wherever you get your podcasts, at Like Mother,
Like Murder.